Less than an hour away from New Orleans and Baton Rouge sits the quaint city of Hammond, Louisiana. Often nicknamed the Crossroads of the South, the city is located at the intersection of two of the United States' most heavily traveled interstate highways, I-55 and I-12. With a total area of 12.8 miles and over 20,000 residents, Hammond is the largest city and commercial hub of Tangipahoa Parish. Today, visitors to Hammond can find a beautiful downtown area, bustling restaurants, exciting festivals, an airport, modern shopping centers, a diverse population, and one of the fastest growing universities in the country, Southeastern Louisiana University.
Hammond or Tangipahoa Parish gives you a mixture of things that you don't find anywhere else, or at least no place I've ever been or even read about, which is namely, you have a rural area, but you also have a university town, a cosmopolitan area. You have exurbia. In fact, you have really a microcosm of Louisiana.
Hammond is the hub of Tangipahoa Parish. Of course, we're home to Southeastern Louisiana University and the North Shore Technical College. So we're very blessed to have those in our parish. We have a lot of eateries, the boutique shopping, the arts, Columbia Theater, the African American Heritage Museum. It's fun, people are happy. The kind of people that live in Hammond are the people that you want to surround yourself with. It's a great place to have your family.
However, before it became a thriving city, Hammond was a vastly different place.
The settlement of Hammond at the beginning, if you say the origin point of Hammond, is subject to a little bit of controversy, but the facts are what they are. The wooded area out here, one of the things that drew people to the area were the pine trees, and it was an untouched, great natural resource, and of course the cypress trees to the south. But the pine trees could be used for a lot more things than just cutting timber. Now, the forests were harvested and the timber was taken across the lakes and everything to be used in construction in New Orleans and other places like that. But it was more than that. They would also cut them down and they would create charcoal, like smelting pits, and they would build these mounds where you could burn the timber, and these charcoal pits would result in usable products from that. Also, tar, pitch, turpentine, resin could be extracted, from, which we collectively call navel stores, could be extracted from the pine trees. And so an enterprising Swedish man named Peter Hammond arrived in the area specifically to do that.
The city is named for Peter Hammond, possibly anglicized for Peter av Hammerdale, a Swedish immigrant who first settled the area around 1818. Peter, a sailor, had been briefly imprisoned by the British at Dartmoor Prison during the Napoleonic Wars. He broke jail during a prison riot, made his way back to the sea, and later left his ship in New Orleans, where he used his savings to buy then inexpensive land northwest of Lake Pontchartrain.
You could get land from the federal government by settling on it. And there are documents that show his acquisition of land over some period of time between, say, around 1830, he first shows up in the censuses here.
So Peter Hammond settles on what is now Charles Street, where his grave is to this day under the big oak tree. And Peter Hammond began this process. He had a little plant here, a place where he could make creosote and tars and things such as that. And he was involved in the lumber industry.
According to some information that I have found, he had, as a young man, gotten the skill of barrel making. So he started cutting down trees and making barrels, and these would be sold, and he was a tar burner because you would seal the edges of the barrel with that to make it waterproof or hold any liquid or whatever was in it. Ultimately, he did marry, and he got married in 1830 to a woman named Caroline Tucker. Her father, whose name was Zelotes Tucker, I'm not sure that's how you pronounce it. It's Zelotes, and that varies from census to census too. He and his brother, Beza Tucker, that family had an interesting choice of names, lived right next door to each other, Peter Hammond and they. So actually, who were people going to marry in that day and time? They were not going to go searching here, there, and yonder as they do now. They were going to marry somebody in the neighborhood for a lot of different reasons. They were there. They knew more or less what families they were marrying into, and that was something that people had to take into consideration then, as they should do now.
And then the big impetus to development came through in 1852 to 1854 with the construction of the New Orleans-Jackson Railroad.
The New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern was a 206-mile railway originally commissioned by the state of Illinois, with both Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln being among its supporters in the 1851 Illinois legislature. It connected Canton, Mississippi with New Orleans and was completed just prior to the American Civil War.
And this was a huge deal because it set up watering stations and supply stations for the railroad at 10-mile intervals. Now, Hammond missed out on that. It was not one of the initial stops because it was Manchac, then up to Ponchatoula, then Tickfaw, then Amite, then Tangipahoa, and so on north to Jackson, Mississippi.
Peter Hammond saw right away that this could help develop this area because this would be a railroad. And let's face it, if you're harvesting timber and timber products, if you're beginning to grow some things, some corn and maybe some few other things, and they did grow cotton in this area at one time. There was a gin and a meat. You need to get it to a market, and the railroad was a logical way to do it. There had been some commerce by boat with New Orleans over the years. But Peter Hammond saw that this could be an important commercial juncture.
He wished to see a railroad go through his land, and so he contacted people in New Orleans who were putting together a railroad that would connect a railroad that was at Hazelhurst, Mississippi, and come down to New Orleans. And this says he donated the right-of-way through 80 acres of his land and donated the labor of his slaves in the construction of the road. Not the railroad, but the road that would bring people to that area. It says that he may have had considerable influence with the engineers who surveyed the route for the railroad. So he was working what different ways he could to be sure that a railroad was established in that area. So he must have been a far-seeing person.
This created opportunity for one of the big developers, and some people would say the biggest developer of the area to arrive. And he, of course, was Charles E. Cate, C.E. Cate. He had arrived in New Orleans. He, like many other people who end up in Hammond, was a Yankee, came to New Orleans, and was in the shoe manufacturing business. And he became aware also of the property and the available land there north of the lake in what is the Hammond area today. And as war clouds began to develop, and here he is building, manufacturing shoes.
1861, he realized he was getting all his inventory from the north, and they weren't going to have any more shoe manufacturing facilities that he could call upon on a regular basis to get shoes shipped to the south. So he came to Hammond as a way of actually building a shoe factory to make shoes. Not knowing what type of shoes he was going to make at that time, because then the Confederacy came in and signed a contract with him to make shoes for the Confederate Army, which he did.
He realized that, look, two things are likely to happen. The Yankees are certain to try to seize New Orleans because it's the South, one great metropolis, and of course the key to the mouth of the Mississippi River. But also that if they do take the city, that they're likely to take the surrounding countryside, and so the supplies he needed, like the leather and things like that for the shoes, would be cut off. So he moved to this area and set up shop there, partly to be in hiding, so to speak, from the Yankees so that they couldn't find him, and partly also because he would have a ready supply of materials.
When Cate and his family first settled the area, it was not much more than a railroad crossing and a wilderness of pine trees. Cate purchased the land from Peter Hammond for 35 cents an acre. He also bought additional acreage from the state, ultimately acquiring 15,000 acres of property.
And so around 1861, Charles Cate arrives, sets up his shoe factory, and he begins the construction of both the shoe factory itself, but also a timber mill, which as they cleared the area, they used the products of the timber, and he built a big boarding house for his workers, and a couple of more buildings rose up in connection with that, homes and the like. That then, of course, made this a target of the Yankees when they did come.
There was Civil War action in this area. They were stationed in New Orleans, and the infamous Ben Butler was the commanding general there. And Butler was known to want to steal everything he could get his hands on. And he heard there was a lot of cotton up here. So he sent an army up the tracks.
In the spring of 1862, the Federals seized New Orleans and steamed up the river very quickly and burned parts of Baton Rouge. Now, that's subject to controversy and everything, but all our research is saying, yeah, when they shelled the city and everything, it did provoke some fires. But they were seeking to intimidate the area and to secure their hold on New Orleans, and so they sent raiding parties out into the countryside. And they became aware of the Cate Shoe Factory. Now, shoes were a huge thing to the Confederate Army. And if you read anything about later in the war and everything, 1 in 8 Confederate soldiers had shoes on. So you got to understand, these guys aren't just outmanned, outgunned, starving, but they're barefoot, in all periods of the year. So producing shoes for them was a big deal. And as soon as federal authorities find out, wait, you mean there's a shoe factory just across the lake producing these things, and ancillary products for the Confederate Army that came out of production as well, they sent raids towards the area. And one of the first big fights, they came right up the railroad at Ponchatoula there. And a lot of the fighting, that time they were driven out of Ponchatoula, but a lot of the fighting, they were trying to get across that trestle bridge to get into Hammond, the objective being the Cate Shoe Factory and to destroy all the byproducts of it.
And they got to Ponchatoula and they burned Ponchatoula down except for the Masonic Hall because their commander was a Mason. And they had sent a little naval fleet up the Tickfaw River to Springfield. And their goal after they stole all the cotton they could was to attack the shoe factory in Hammond. But some guerrillas stopped them between Ponchatoula and Hammond. They turned the army back, and they were so angry that the Union Army tore up all the tracks between here and New Orleans and wrapped them around trees. They called it Yankee bow ties.
In a second raid, later in 1862, they did reach Hammond after some fierce fighting around Ponchatoula and even sniping, and even local citizens coming out and sniping at them because the shoe factory itself was so important to the fledgling economy of the area. That's where people worked and stuff. And sure enough, they did take the town, they burned the shoe factory, destroyed all of the machinery, did everything they could to damage the infrastructure of the fledgling community there. And it was a horrific event for them. But Charles E. Cate was not the type of guy to be intimidated by that. He even did some enterprises where among the things that the people in the area were enormously short of was like salt. You couldn't find it, and they were reduced even to going into the smokehouses where meat had been cured and digging up the dirt from the floor of the smokehouses and boiling the dirt to extract the remaining salt from it. When sources like that began to run out, they would attempt excursions to Mobile, which was still in Confederate hands, and it had salt works there, and several very successful ones that Charles E. Cate himself organized. And so Cate my understanding of it is, had a change of philosophy. He said, we need to try to become kind of self-sufficient in this area. So he began to lay out streets. He began to encourage in every way he could people to come to the area. Eventually, finally, the end of the war came, and that would be a big impetus for the development of Hammond. Cate would be very enterprising and trying, he was a Northerner himself, so he had no qualms about inviting other Yankees to come in. And this would put Hammond at odds with some of the other local communities, like in Ponchatoula or Amite, which was very contemptuous of, Yankees coming in right after the Civil War and everything like that. Well, Hammond was inviting them.
And after the Civil War, he began promoting the expansion, the settlement of this area. He particularly promoted broadly up north in states like Iowa and Illinois. Cate was a Northerner himself. He'd come from Massachusetts. A lot of the advertisement for settlement in this area was done through the railroad. They published their own little pamphlets and things like that, to promote settlement down here, so they could sell off some of the land and also create business for themselves. People would start farms down here and grow vegetables and strawberries, and they would ship them up north. on the railroad.
So Reconstruction was a troubled time politically and economically in the area. But as we were saying, you know, Kate encouraged people to come into the area, and one of those groups was the famous Iowa group that creates the Iowa division there of Hammond and everything. And these were several men from Iowa that came in. They were investors, and Kate worked with them. They set up streets. They did all kinds of development in the town and everything, and Hammond began to thrive a little bit.
It became very popular for people in the Midwest to move here because two reasons. One was the milder winters. If you ever wonder why Hammond has streets named Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Dakota, we have West Dakota and East Dakota, even though the nation has North and South Dakota. The early settlers of Hammond did this on purpose because they wanted these Midwesterners to feel at home. If you were from Iowa, hey, you can live on Iowa Street. And the first subdivision in Hammond was that area where Iowa Street is today. So more people moved in and the city began to grow.
Because the railroad is the big impetus to development in the area, and Kate worked very closely with that. Now that brought positives and negatives that also created some animosities in the region there. The railroad could do very good things for people that were connected to it. If you were not connected to it, though, the railroad was the purveyor of the sharecropping movement. A lot of people lost their land. They had to pay back taxes after the Civil War, and some people don't realize these people that were living in this area when the war ended, they weren't told you just owe taxes for the current year. They were told you owe taxes for 1861, 1862, 1863, 1864, 1865, all of the years that you were in the Confederate States and not paying taxes to the federal government. You owe all of that. So many people lost their land. Northerners would come in, buy these properties up, or other people that were well fixed that could do that. And the railroads came in and helped them set up these general stores, which could charge very exorbitant rates. And most of the people that had been landowners, not all, but most, were driven into sharecropping, which meant they had to work. They essentially lost their land, but they could continue farming it. They had to eat, so they had to strike a deal with the furnishing merchant who had the local store, and he would extend them food and things like that at very high rates on credit. And at the end of the year, when you came in, you had to grow cotton. When you came in to settle up, you never had enough to pay your entire bill, so you were forced back into that. When the railroads helped facilitate the arrival of fertilizers and things like that, it meant some got ahead over others, and a lot of the animosities between these groups were based on things like that.
You would think that, so soon after the Civil War, there would have been a lot of conflict between the local people and these settlers from the north coming in. I've not read of a lot of conflict between them. The only conflict you see between them at times is political, in that some of these northerners who came in were Republicans and were supportive of the various Reconstruction governments, and obviously the locals were not. But to me, one of the interesting things about a lot of these northern settlers is the longer they stayed, they became more and more like the population that was here. They became kind of integrated into the white society that was here. Very few of them continued to be Republicans. They switched to Democratic Party. They just seemed to kind of eventually just kind of blend into the society that's here.
Again, politically, though, there was a bit of a dichotomy between towns, communities like Hammond and Roseland, which were attracting as locals that had been here for a long time, called them carpetbagger communities and everything, which were groups encouraging investment and people to come settle from the north, whereas a town like Ponchatoula or Hammond was very much still wearing the gray, and everything, and flying the Confederate flag and remembering the lost cause and stuff. So it did create some kind of dichotomy in the area.
In 1870, the town's namesake and founder, Peter Hammond, passed away unaware of the impact he made on the fledgling community he helped found.
1830 census, he shows up living in St. Helena Parish. He settled on this property, and the property never moved, but the parish lines did. That was 1830, it was in St. Helena. By 1840, Livingston had split off from St. Helena, so he was living in the same spot, but that was in Livingston Parish. By 1850, it was still Livingston, and 1860 it was still Livingston. This parish was not formed until March of 1869. So the first census that shows this parish is 1870 census. And he died at some time during 1870, I think probably before the census was taken, because he isn't listed on that census. His wife is, and some of their children. He lived to a really good age, but according to my understanding, he was a farmer again, not so much a businessman. And he was out doing some sort of insect repelling type work with an arsenic solution, and got an infection and died from that. And so he was into the business of protecting his crops with arsenic.
This is one that was printed in the old Hammond Vindicator, a newspaper I worked for part-time when I first came here, way back in 1934. And it says how Hammond received her name. During the Civil War, there was a large shoe factory owned by Mr. C.E. Cate, where shoes were manufactured for the Confederate soldiers. Of course, those shoes were sent in carload lots as fast as they were manufactured, and many came to know this place as Cate's Switch. But there was a family by the name of Hammond who furnished meals for the railroad men, and by then it was called Hammond. The two names were suggested, and as Mr. Hammond had been a resident longer, and the word Hammond being more appropriate for a town, she was so named. In 1889, the people of Hammond decided that they wanted to incorporate as a city. And this is a proclamation released by the then Justice of the Peace, William E. Libby. This is issued for the 7th Ward, Hammond Station, and I declare as a result of the election held on the 3rd day of April, 1887, the following officers to have been elected. For Mayor, H.C. Mooney. Trustee, C.E. Cate, E.M. Gallup, F.B. Saunders, N.D. Hendricks, and F.W. Wright. The proclamation was the beginning of a new era for Hammond. Already, though, the beauty of the place, and here's the way they would write in those days. The place has magnificent streets. They are so symmetrically laid off, with beautiful oaks planted by its first settlers, Mr. C.E. Cate and Mr. K.D. Wilcombe. We have become noted as a health resort, and families with their household goods, livestock, fine horses are arriving daily seeking a milder climate where just as easily they might have take up their farming interest. And thus the strawberry culture is growing, fruit interest is developing, the wood and timber industry is busy, until this little hamlet had changed completely into a good-sized town. We now have a new schoolhouse. It had to be built to accommodate the great number of children who are coming here. Hammond continued to flourish. By 1889, there were 3 newspapers in town, a daily and 2 weeklies. And there were more than 4,000 people subscribing to these newspapers, so that's indication that the city had grown considerably. There were 2 good hotels, and both operated year-round. There was 1 large sawmill, a brickyard with modern kilns, 2 box factories. The reason for box factories were if you're growing produce, you got to put them in boxes. They had no cardboard in those days. There was an ice and a bottling plant where they bottled pure water. And it was known everywhere what a great health resort Hammond had. We had the best railroad service, 16 passenger trains stopped daily, and it was the only double track in the South. And the writer continues, some of our most important public improvements are street lights, and later on a telephone, 12 miles of paved sidewalks, a complete waterworks system, one of the finest depots on the southern end of the railroad, and last but not least, a $445,000 schoolhouse with all the modern first-class improvement that are available in the whole state of Louisiana. And thus you can see that in the 1880s, Hammond was flourishing. And the people obviously had a great deal of pride in their community, and it was becoming a really, apparently, a very nice place to live and settle and raise a family.
Kate's rationale that the town would grow in proportion to its access to the railroad proved prophetic. Railroad records confirm that in 22 years, income from the Illinois Central's Hammond station rose from less than $500 a year in 1885 to $40,000 in just 1 month in 1907.
When Kate came up here, it was like a crossing, and they had to stop. When Kate came here, you could get on and off the train. If you went to the track, you could flag it down, or you tell the conductor you want to get off at Hammond Crossing, and they'd let you off. But it wasn't a regular stop, and that's one of the things that Kate did. He was a holdout on the Illinois Central line. He wouldn't sell them the property, but he gave him a right-of-way. And the only thing he wanted was to have every regular scheduled passenger train stop in Hammond. So if I can get the train to stop here, I can build the town. And that's what he wanted. It's like putting an exit off an interstate into a community. It makes all the difference in the world. And that's what he did. And it stayed like that for a long, long time.
Hammond's next growth spurt would grow from its very own soil. Hammond was about to become the strawberry capital of the world.
My understanding is the first raising of strawberries occurred actually closer to independence, and I know the father of Mr. Harry D. Wilson, who would go on to become the Commissioner of Agriculture in the state for years and everything. His father's often given credit for being one of the first people to grow strawberries in the area, but it all moved towards Hammond. With Kate's vision and others working with him and everything, they began attracting hotels and stuff, like everybody's familiar, with the Oaks Hotel, which a lot of people know probably by its later name, the Casa de Fresa, which means the House of the Berries, of course, and everything. They then created a spot where the strawberries could be sold commercially and everything on a national basis. I think starting around 1900, they began to put them on the trains at Hammond. And these hotels that grew up were very important to the development of Hammond, because people forget. They think, well, I'm driving from Baton Rouge to Hammond today, so I'll go over and do everything I need in Baton Rouge and come back. Or I'll go over to Hammond, do what I need, and I'll just drive right back home. Travel between communities, even if you were just going between Amite and Hammond, it was a long way. Imagine, walking that distance or riding a horse or in a buggy or whatever, So the more that commercial activity came to Hammond, the more the hotels were established, the bigger it grew. And strawberry farming was at the center of what was happening, because the strawberry buyers would come down, they would stay at the hotels right there on the grounds of the Casa de Fresa. They had the cabin, they called it, and everything, and basically it was an auction warehouse where they would auction these off. They would put the berries onto refrigerated cars and ship them all over the country. And that was beginning in the early 20th century, but extended into the 1920s, and then right at the start of the 1930s, strawberries appeared to be absolutely a mega economic motivator in the area.
At the height of the strawberry industry around the turn of the century, and this is, my wife's grandmother's told me this before, in Ponchatoula and Hammond, they would load as many as 40 or 50 boxcars every day with strawberries. And that's when strawberries were really king here.
Well, Hammond used to be, we had it before Ponchatoula had it. We were known as the strawberry capital of the world. It was very important to me, as a child, because when I was coming up, my parents raised strawberries, and the only way we got extra money after we finished, raising strawberries at home, we were allowed to go out and pick for other people and make for money. But now, since Hammond has, have had this urban growth, Ponchatoula and those nice people are the strawberry capital of the world. And I think that's a nice thing. It speaks volumes for the whole parish in this area.
And then something kind of unexpected happened. One of the things that's very beneficial to our area, like why we have sugar cane and strawberries and things like that, is because we have such a long growing season. And then right at the height, when real money was being made for people here in Hammond, and it was spurring so much development, a devastating freeze occurred. And the likes of which we rarely have around here. But it wiped out the strawberry crop for that year. And what that made people realize is that everybody can't be part of this. The people that had deep pockets, they weathered that. The people that, were on the margins and everything, they realized then that strawberry farming was not going to be what was going to rescue them from the poverty they'd been in since the end of the Civil War. So Hammond leveled off a little bit, and the strawberry farming expanded out into Livingston Parish and into, down Ponchatoula, of course. Again, there's that little bit of competition between those two communities and everything, but it still was very much a part of the economy.
Kate died in 1916 at the age of 85. He and his family are buried in the cemetery on the grounds of Grace Memorial Episcopal Church. Today, Kate's legacy can be found all over the city he helped build.
He liked putting back into the community. Whatever was good for the city was good for him, but he put a lot into other people. He was a big believer in education, real big believer in education, because he felt if you could educate the people, they became better, citizens in the community, became more productive, and you can build more with an educated population. He was on the school board, but he's also on the state level. He was on the State Board of Education. Governor Foster and Governor Nichols appointed him to that position. That was kind of one of his high points, I think, in his life. He was always fairly political in a lot of things he did. He was active in the community, but he's also active politically through his life as much as anything else. He was on the city council, didn't want to be the mayor or anything, but he was active in politics.
And then another big thing happened that was just a huge shot in the arm to development in Hammond, and that was the arrival of Southeastern, what we know today as Southeastern Louisiana University, Southeastern Louisiana College, before that Hammond Junior College, before that. However, there had long been discussion of placing some type of institution of higher education in the Central Florida parishes. And there were a group here in Hammond, again, following the same in the ways of Charles E. Cate and others, who wanted to attract things. Some initial state investigators about this had offered the opportunity to Amite at first, and then famously in the Amite City Council meeting, the council voted overwhelmingly no, because they didn't want the character of the town changed.
Universities at that time brought in professors from out of town, but these were foreigners. We didn't want all these outsiders coming into our town, because they were transients, and that's the way they looked at university professors. They weren't born and raised here. Back then, you were born and raised in a community, you never left.
Hammond, though, seeking to grow, develop, not having qualms about people from the north, whatever it may be coming in, it enthusiastically embraced the opportunity. And though they had some trouble with the school board in the parish at the time, and in fact, it came, almost, as they said, fisticuffs in the school board meeting as they discussed it, which us here in Tangipahoa Parish know nothing about, of course, and everything.
At the time in Louisiana, the road system was atrocious. And if you have people ever wonder why we have what we call these geographic colleges, we had Northwestern, Northeast, Southeastern, ULL, which was now the University of Southwest Louisiana, Nicholls State, McNeese. It was because you could not travel from here to Baton Rouge to go to LSU. The roads were too bad. So by putting these strategically located regional colleges, it gave the kids on the farm a chance to get an education. And these community leaders came together and they said, we want to establish a college in Hammond. And they went to the Tangipahoa Parish School Board, and the school board said no.
Linus Sims was the one that really had the bug for education around this area. And he got a businessman named Oscar Donaldson to kind of get with him. And then they hit Lucius McGee, who was a very well-respected physician in the area and was a person that just seemed to be able to get things done. And slowly but surely, they talked the Chamber of Commerce into, getting a junior college or something here of higher education, let's say. And they started working for it. And then they found out that T.H. Harris, who was then superintendent of education in the state, was in town, so they kind of finagled him without him knowing it to come to a meeting with the Chamber of Commerce, and they hit him with the idea of a college in the Hammond area. And eventually, it caught a little fire. He was not against it. And they eventually passed a millage, I think it was wards 5, 6, 7, and 8, passed a 1-cent millage to help do some initial funding.
And the college was started, and it began to grow very rapidly. And what's remarkable, literally from that first meeting, my understanding has always been that from that first meeting they had in Hammond to discuss it to the time they opened the doors on the college initially was less than 1 year. That's how deeply the people were eager to see that happen.
And it started right where on Morris Street, where Neal Corporation is today. That was the first site. There was a faculty of 5, and I think the first class had 40 people in it.
3 times since it was created, Southeastern was the benefactor of bond issues. Can you imagine passing a tax for Southeastern? Well, your grandparents did, and we're glad to pay it because they didn't need to be convinced what it meant to have a college in Hammond, Louisiana. And in fact, Southeastern came here because our ancestors wanted it, because the business community in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1940s kept passing bond issues to increase the university to the next level. And today it would seem like science fiction that we would pass a tax.
I mean, in 1937 was I would say it was a big year because that's when Strawberry Stadium was built. And with Strawberry Stadium came dormitories, came a new snack bar, came the Student Union Memorial Building. Both sides of the stadium had dormitory rooms. The bookstore was there, post office was there. So 1937, and I think maybe a year or 2 later, McGee Hall was built. And that really, once you start getting permanent facilities, it really begins to grow. At that time, it was just a small, close-knit, good university. You got to know a lot of people. It was driven by fraternities and sororities and athletics, all had hand in hand in helping the school maintain a certain level. It never dropped. It just kind of then all of a sudden in the 80s, we just hit the boom and just started blowing and going, and the student enrollment increased a lot.
They bring a lot of special culture and opportunity to people in our area from all over the region. And listen, those guys do a great job with limited resources. We still step it up and provide great national award, nationally ranked programs at the university. It's absolutely a must that we keep that university fully running and operational and integrated into our community.
Now, it doesn't take much imagination to see the profound effect that Southeastern had on Hammond. And here's why, for several reasons. Besides the job opportunities, it offers entertainment in the way of sports and athletic events, plays and dance reviews and recitals, concerts. It also brings into the community highly educated, creative people, artists, and it just makes the community a whole lot better place for everyone.
I re-enrolled in school because I wanted to enhance my writing skills, and I was able to reintroduce myself to a lot of things that I had forgotten about or I just hadn't used in a while. But I got that at Southeastern, and I saw a love from the professors to the students and wanting them to know that this is the place to be. And if you want to do it, if you make your mind up and do it, we'll help you to get there. That's Southeastern.
First of all, you got 15,000 students, basically. You got Southeastern as the largest employer, I think, in Tangipahoa Parish. I mean, just those 2 factors alone, you're throwing in a lot of extra income, a lot of extra money into the parish. Just the one football playoff game Southeastern hosted a couple years ago, the 2 weekends we hosted playoff games, I think a multi-million-dollar income just over 2 weekends for the parish, and that's just off 2 sporting events. And just the fact that, you bring in teams, it's just the economy. People come in from outside, gives you a rallying point for athletics, for all different phases. People come in, travel in for ball games. And then without all the people coming in from outside, just within the community, the number of people and alumni in this area that contribute to the economy of Tangipahoa Parish and the city of Hammond and South Tangipahoa is just amazing. And I think that's where Southeastern plays the biggest part. It is an integral part of the economy of Southeast Louisiana and the success we've had in some of our academic programs. For a long time we were known as a very good teacher education a school. But now you look at our nursing department, our business department, you know, those are all excellent on a national level, not just a local level. And those are far and wide recognized. You know, and we have some subsidiaries. We just voted one of the top colleges and universities in the country for our food in the cafeteria, which, I mean, that's pretty hard to come by. And then, you know, our TV station here has won some national awards. Just, you can go on with the, that's part of academics, but it's not, you know, in the classroom like anything. So we've had a very good, I would say, expanding part of the university, and that's part of the growth of Southeastern.
Hammond even had a part to play during World War II.
The Hammond Army Air Base, as it was called, you know, was yet another impetus to development in the Hammond area, because it brought, you know, soldiers during World War II into the area, and it brought all their families and support personnel into the area too. And of course, it laid the groundwork for the airport which we have today.
In those days, it was called the Army Air Corps, established a base here in Hammond, where the airport is to this day. And it's hard to imagine now, but this was a rather large base. They had, I think there was 8 barracks there. There were 3 dining halls, recreation center, a post office, a fire station, a tower, and a lot of men who went on to have distinguished careers in the Army Air Corps served here. One of the reasons why the base was important was fighter pilots and bomber pilots had to learn how to use their guns. What they would do is they would fly, I think, B-25s out over Lake Pontchartrain, trailing either big long sheets of cloth or gliders, and then let the pilots fire at that. The thought being the bullets will fall in the lake and won't hit anybody, so it won't matter. If you think about it, it makes sense. And they also had a bombing range to the north of the airfield. And I know when I first came here, I had a friend who was a quail hunter, and we used to go quail hunt on what they still call the bombing range. They would drop 500-pound sacks of flour on dummy tanks and other things on the ground. So during the war years, that base flourished.
Also, little less discussed is there was a prisoner of war camp near Hammond as well during the World War II period, and they brought German POWs in, and they used them to cut timber and clear land and other things like that. And interestingly enough, years ago, when I was in The Hague in the Netherlands at the railroad station there and everything, and a man looked at my backpack I was getting off it, and he saw I had a little Louisiana symbol and everything. And he said, he looked at me and he said, I was in Louisiana. He was speaking to me in German, of course, and everything. And then, you know, when I spoke back, and you could tell I was American, we switched to English and everything. And he was like, well, yeah, I was in Louisiana. He said, during World War II. And I said, oh, okay, is that right? You know, down and visit? And he said, no, actually, ich war in Gefängnis. And he went like that, and he said it meant I was a prisoner. And I was like, oh, okay. And I'm like, I'm sorry about that and everything. And he said, you know, I said, oh, well, you know, so he said, no, it's okay. He said, we were in a delightful little place, you know, nothing but trees around us. He said, boy, I hated cutting those trees and everything. He said, but it smells so good every morning. It's a place called Hammond. I was like, Hammond, are you kidding me? I'm from right up the road in a town called Amite and everything. And so he insisted on buying me lunch that day and everything, and would tell me stories about riding on trucks through town and everything, and whistling at the girls and stuff like that, and how much it would, you know, upset the guys around here. And he said there were rumors that you know, if we would do this and that, you know, go over to some guy's house and help him load some stuff on his truck and everything, that he would get an opportunity for us to get away and drink some fresh milk and stuff like that. And so he had all these little stories to tell, but you know, there's so many of these little tidbits of history that end up dealing with Hammond, you know, and that's why I love studying this area.
And sometimes you say how history repeats itself. After all those years, at the end of the war, the base was given to the city of Hammond, and it languished for a long time. It wasn't really in the greatest of shape, but people realized we needed an airport here, and they gradually began to improve it. And today it's an excellent airport for a city this size. And now the military has come back. We have the aviation wing of the Louisiana National Guard stationed right here in Hammond at their magnificent new headquarters. And we have the U.S. Customs Service here at the airport. And of course, last year they opened the airport tower.
When it was realized that a national highway system was needed, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 provided for a highway replacing the old Route 66. As with most interstates that end in a 5, Interstate 55 is a major cross-country north-south route connecting the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. The highway begins in La Place and runs nearly 66 miles to the state line near Kentwood, then continues on to Chicago, where it ends U.S. Route 41. The entire length was completed in 1979.
When I-55 comes through, it really changed the economic whole stratagem of the region. And for some communities, it was very sad because towns to the north, say for example, of Hammond, like Amite, Independence, Kentwood, like that, they thought I-55 would be a wonderful boom for them. It turned out to be an unmitigated disaster though, because what could happen when the interstate opened up, they realized they could get on the interstate and drive to a larger town and shop there. And so soon you started seeing all the little shoe stores, all the men's clothing stores. You know, you're always gonna have some women's clothing stores every place, you know, but they too were affected, and the various little enterprises that you would expect a town to have to sustain itself began to shut down. But it became a boom for Hammond, because Hammond was the closest spot that people in those communities could get on the interstate and get to. There was just one piece of the puzzle still left, and that was an east-west corridor. And through the efforts of Congressman Jimmy Morrison, he argued, very rightfully so, as we've seen more recently, that the New Orleans and I-10 going down into New Orleans was subject to flooding, especially during hurricane season and the such. And he said, we need an east-west corridor that will connect, you know, like from Mobile, Alabama to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on over to Houston.
Morrison was born in Hammond, attended public schools, and went on to obtain the Juris Doctor degree from Tulane University Law School in New Orleans in 1934. Afterwards, he practiced law in Hammond with partner Joseph A. Sims. In 1936, he ran unsuccessfully for the Louisiana State Senate. But in 1937, he wrote the charter for the newly formed Louisiana Farmers Protective Union and launched a public relations campaign on behalf of union members in the Strawberry Belt, centered around Tangipahoa Parish. Finally, in 1942, Morrison was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He represented Louisiana's 6th District from 1943 to 1967.
Can you imagine, forget Baton Rouge and New Orleans, can you imagine Little Hammond, Louisiana, late 1940s, early 1950s, electing a congressman? Not only did that happen, but James Morrison was able to use his power to get I-12. There was no original plan of Dwight Eisenhower for Interstate 12. I-10 was going through New Orleans. James Morrison got I-12. And that's what happened. And it was an interstate spur that back at the time had no justification whatsoever because there was no population to speak of on the North Shore. But it's something to think about how times have changed. You know one thing about the 50s, Tangipahoa voters couldn't have been apathetic not to get all that. Well, literally you had in James Morrison a guy, and there's a famous picture of him bringing a flat of strawberries to President Truman. And then of course, ditto for Dwight Eisenhower, the president who came after Truman, of course, and James Morrison was able to lobby. And there were other congressmen in other locales that did the same thing. I mean, the interstate system was transformed from its original concept into a lot more local projects as part of it. But again, if Hammond, Louisiana had not banded together to elect a congressman, and that congressman had not fought to get I-12, we'd be living in a radically different area, and not for the better.
And so Mr. Jimmy, as we all know him, you know, went before Congress and everything and got money appropriated to get I-12 constructed through this area. And then when you had the confluence of I-12 and I-55 hitting right at the location of Hammond, you had the final piece in place for Hammond's growth. And it has been remarkable in what has happened. You know, you're talking about a sleepy little village, you know, even 50 years before, with a few little hotels and some strawberry marketing and stuff like that, turning, you know, then getting a college, then getting one interstate, then getting another interstate that the confluence is right there on them, you know, the intersection rather is right there at your town, you know, and so Hammond's future, like its past, is bright.
Being the largest city and having the interstates cross, I-12 and I-55 cross, and the railroads crossing in our city, the great airport that Hammond has, you know, it's a must that Hammond is strong and robust. It's kind of now the bellwether for all of Tangipahoa Parish, and it, you know, as things go in Hammond, the rest of the parish follows.
When I look at Hammond as I guess I call it the mega hub of everything, because everything feeds into Hammond because of the railroads, the interstates, the airport, a number of reasons. Highway 51, everything stops here and starts here in Hammond.
Economically, it is constantly growing. In fact, in Hammond, we just added Zaxby's, we added Dairy Queen, and also very soon Home Depot will be open. And then there will be another group of businesses which I can't name at this particular time, that would definitely have an impact on Hammond. In fact, last year, economically, Hammond had in capital investment, I think the sum was roughly about, to round it off, was like $58 million. And it's projected that going in next year, you know, with the businesses and economic development coming in, that capital investment may go over $68 million. So those are very positive things. Then you consider the university is constantly growing. Norfolk's, you know, they're growing and doing an excellent job. They're always doing expansions. And then, of course, we have the technical school, and they're growing. So it's just kind of a good place to be now.
My estimation has grown and matured beyond what I'm sure anyone could have imagined. There's an interesting thing. In Renshaw's newspaper in 1894, he has a quote from what, believe it or not, Springfield had a newspaper at the time called the Springfield Bee. And Springfield was a thriving community because it depended on water trade on the Albany River. And in the Springfield Bee, the editor wrote, "If we are not careful, one day that little community to the northeast of us called Hammond will surely outstrip us in size and importance." And Springfield has a population of, I think, about 1,500, and Hammond has a population of 25,000. So I think the editor of the Springfield Bee in the 1890s could see the future. And that little tiny village of Hammond has far outstripped any other community in this region.
This was the very first official state historic marker in Louisiana, and it was dedicated by Lieutenant Governor Bill Dodd on October the 22nd, 1950. And he says, he's quoted in this newspaper article from the Hammond Vindicator as having said, "Here in America for a long time we have been so busy building a nation, we have neglected our history and traditions, and I'm happy that we are now taking concrete steps to perpetuate our own historic shrines in Louisiana." So I think that was very well said about what he was doing and what that was the first effort to do.
You know, one of the things, anybody that lives or has studied or even is just aware of Tangipahoa Parish knows that this region has had a very, very troubled history. For heaven's sakes, up until just very recently, it was known nationally as Bloody Tangipahoa. And the area has had a very troubled past. Hammond was part of that. You know, I'm reminded of the famous newspaper editor, Harding Carter, and his grandfather Will Carter and everything had the newspaper here in Hammond and everything. He, very famously said that he felt like he had to leave the Hammond area because of the intensity of the violence and the passion of people and their politics in the area. So there was a time when the future looked dark here, but that has changed a lot. Hammond has been, in many ways, the big power truck pulling the rest of Tangipahoa and even the surrounding region into a new place in its development. And with the university here, with the intersection of the interstates as we were talking about, with a diversifying economy located in a region that at one time people didn't even want to ride a train through it because people would come out and just fire shots at the trains they go through. Now look at the migration of people into this area. You know, we've got the 2 fastest growing parishes in Louisiana on either side of us. Tangipahoa is growing rapidly itself. All indicators suggest that in the future, Hammond is going to be a prosperous and developing community, and that there's very little that can stop that from happening.